Welcome to Iteration Office Hours. Iteration is one of the 6 values of GitLab, but it's our hardest one as far as I'm concerned. So we constantly challenge ourselves to see how we can do better. And Fabian, I'm very grateful for you sharing an example, one that's near and dear to my heart as well. You want to talk us through it?
Yeah, thanks, Sid. So we finished CI decomposition to gain us some significant headroom on GitLab.com, but we are also already working on the next step to a scalable architecture, which is pods. For those that are not deeply familiar with this, you can essentially think of pods as many different GitLab instances where we can scale horizontally by adding more pods to it, which is very different from how GitLab.com works now. So Sid and many others spent some time outlining sort of pods as the next architecture for GitLab. And we're now actually starting to think about how do we get to pods? And one of the worries that I have is it's a big change, right? We could go off and engineer something and not produce value along the way. And so we are thinking about the big problems that we actually need to address for pods, and also where to start and what to explore early on. Specifically, I'm interested in maybe exploring some things that we can ship and deliver earlier, sort of as individual parts, rather than having to wait for the entirety to finish. And so, Sid, I'd like to talk about sort of 2 ideas that we have to explore some sort of proof of concepts for pods. And the first one is to do with authentication. So one of the problems I think we need to solve is how do users actually authenticate and then get access to individual pods? And the other one is really how do we route a user from where they start to the relevant pod where all of their data lives. And so the idea that we had is to sort of try out how that actually works early on, because depending on how that goes, we could actually start creating those and ship them, even if we have a single pod, which is GitLab.com right now. And so that's very early on in the stages, but I thought this would be a good opportunity to discuss this, for you to ask some questions, and that's it.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. I think that the proposals as they're in the agenda right now are to introduce kind of new layers, like kind of put something in front of GitLab.com.
That's right.
Those are big changes. It's very hard to iterate on them. And when you make them, they affect everyone. We know we can run GitLab.com at its current size. And luckily we have some headroom as well. But the important thing is we can run it at its current size. We also know that we're growing as a company. Last quarter, revenue grew 75% year over year. We have to keep scaling. But that only means that we kind of have to solve for their growth. We don't have to like replace GitLab.com. We just have to make sure that the growth doesn't impact it. So I see it more as maybe, look, these things are hard. I'm just going to argue a point here. And who knows whether it's a good idea or not. But maybe we only have to siphon off the growth. So if you talk about authentication, yeah, you could put a whole new layer in front. But we already have authentication on GitLab.com. GitLab.com is not only an OAuth client, but it's also an OAuth provider. So why don't I just sign on onto GitLab.com in the normal way, and we use our OAuth providership to authenticate to the other pods. There's no need for a new layer. We need to scale GitLab.com not because too many people are trying to log in. It's much more about like all the usage they do, all the issues they create, all the pipelines, all those kind of things. If we kind of take parts away from GitLab.com and we end up with a monolithic, the same kind of monolith and database we have today, where like, I don't know, 1 billion people are signing in, not a forward-looking statement, then that's fine. We can probably handle that. or we'll solve it some other way. But so kind of don't build something in front for everyone to use, but just keep doing it the normal way and reuse functionality already in the product to authenticate to other services. How does that sound?
Yeah, I think that sounds good. I think I like the idea to solve for the growth that we need to siphon off. So if we can use or reuse what we have already, I think that'll be great. So I'll make sure I want to avoid building something entirely new as well, because that's expensive and difficult. I'll certainly ask the team to see like what can we actually use that we have for authentication, and how would that look if we just added a pod sort of to GitLab.com right now and show that as a proof of concept. So that makes sense to me.
Great. That's cool. The second thing you talked about is pod routing resolver.
Yes.
I think I'm going in the same direction here. The proposal is kind of putting a service in front. My suggestion would be to lean more into what we already have. For example, we have Gitaly, and in Gitaly, we just keep track in a kind of a database table on GitLab. Like, well, that project, it's assigned that Gitaly server.
Yeah, no,
go ahead.
I think actually what I talked about with Camille here, and he can represent that much better, is that this would be a really thin, almost like a lookup table, where you just say like this goes here, this goes there. I don't know how that hooks into our existing functionality, but I agree that maybe it doesn't need to be big. Right? It needs to be the smallest thing that is good enough to get users into the right pod. I'm not sure how that, like how to accomplish that, but I agree with you.
Yeah, and just the name lookup table already assumes you're going to make a separate table for it, which I think is something you can, something I'm going to challenge. I don't think it should be a separate table. I think the namespace table should have an identifier, and there's a good name for it, which escapes me at the moment, but it's kind of like your resource tier number or something like that. And it depends a bit what the ultimate scale is going to be, but you can think of something where that number is a number between 1 and 1 million. They get kind of randomly assigned to projects, and new projects get random assigned, so you don't have too many hotspots, hopefully. And then you might have a lookup table where you say, hey, this group of numbers maps to this server, because the thing you want to do is you want to be able to load balance. You don't want a whole group to kind of move at the same time. So there you want a bit of granularity. Having 1 million numbers allows you to have 1,000 servers that each serve like a range that's 1,000 numbers. So you're able to move pretty gradually as you rebalance things.
Cool. I think that helps already. I'll take that back to the groups. I think what I'm taking away from it is reuse what we have, try to avoid adding new things where we can, and not add new tables, utilize what is already there. And I think those are good points. Is that fair?
Yeah, and like, look, we know the GitLab.com main database is going to be up. Like that's yes. The whole goal of the company. So that's going to be up. We just have to reduce the load on it, but we don't necessarily have to replace it and create another source of truth. And also for pods, let's work on the stuff that we need most, like where the need is the highest. CI was a great example, but there's maybe other things that are like first in line.
Cool. Thanks. I think that already is very helpful, and I want to make sure that Hannah has enough time as well, as this is a short meeting. So thank you, Sid.
Thank you.
All right, we can go ahead and move on to mine. Hi, Sid. I wanted your advice For my iteration plan for custom roles. Iteration 1 is taking our existing permissions table and making that dynamically populated behind the scenes based on code, rather than static, which it is today. And that will kind of get us towards this is such a big change. We've struggled to break it down. So that's one area where my developers said that would be, having that be dynamically populated would kind of behind the scenes uncouple a lot of things that need to be uncoupled in the permissions department. But that to our customers does not deliver any value. So my first question was, does that still count as an iteration, and is that okay?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks for bringing this thing. I think we're working on a super important improvement in GitLab that a lot of our customers would love to see. So, and it's a super tough one. So thanks for bringing that one. Normally when we ship something, there needs to be customer value. Like if you didn't change the docs, like there's a problem because there should be a bug fixed or a feature added. In this case, we'll dive in a little bit more because I want to understand more, but I can see a case for it. For example, when you change a database organization thing at scale, you'll first like create a new column, you'll populate that column. Every time something is written, you write it twice, then you switch the reading to the new column, and then you deprecate the old column. It's like 4 changes in order to move something. And that happens. And that might very well be the case here. So I think there's good arguments why there isn't like immediate customer value here. It's because we have to move data, and that takes kind of 4 steps, and that is what it is. Can you maybe show kind of the the new database field structure or something like that?
I don't have that. Do you mean show it right now on this call, or do you mean in general?
Well, if you don't have it, you can't show it. But I meant show like screen share the technical proposal in the call.
Okay, I do have a technical proposal, but I don't have. It's not very consumable. I'll link it. It's not visual. Let's say it's just a bunch of words.
That's fine.
Okay. Let's see here. I'll link it. All right, there it is.
Thanks for that. So there's a new role model, have base access level, and download code. What is this download code? Can you help me?
I think that this is based on our MVC definition of the first sort of new role we want to test out, or customization to an existing role would be to be able to add or remove the ability to view code. So that's it.
Okay.
That's what that is.
And the base access level, what is that?
That would be the existing role that it would be based off of. We're starting with the reporter role.
Okay, so now you can say for a reporter whether they're able to download code or not.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of a legacy thing. This is not a base entitlement. Suppose in the future I'd be able to turn off, like, hey, we get download code, we get all these different checkboxes. Like you can do it, you can't do it. Would we still call people reporters and things like that? Well, maybe we would. Yeah, why not? They have a name and then they can do certain things. So, yeah, this is, I had a misconception. Isn't this a role name more than base access level?
Well, let's see, create a new model role with 2 columns, base access level and download code.
I think role, like reporter and like developer are actually numbers in the database. That's probably why it's base access level is going to be a number too.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Thanks, Stan. And then we would, go ahead.
Today, reporters are able to pull download code. It's the guest user that's not allowed to download code. Have we? I'm making an assumption here. Is it the assumption that you can modify this and the guest user remains to be free, or if you modify it and give them kind of reporter and above level access, they're no longer free guest users in Ultimate?
Okay, so I think there's some nuance to your question. So what this MVC is to take the reporter and remove the ability to view code. So that's what that is.
Okay.
And then in the future, our sort of guiding principle for guest users is that if you make a custom role that can do anything more than a guest user can do today, then that role will occupy a seat.
That's fair. Thanks.
And there's now only base access level and download code, but it would have the attributes we'd add to those attributes, like download code, create custom variables, view secrets, things like that. We just keep adding different permissions.
I think so. It sounds like this is a proposal to evaluate the performance of it, because there's all sorts of questions about what happens when you try to look at permissions for a lot of users or a lot of different endpoints. So I think that's the idea.
I think the question is a bit like, what's the quickest way to evaluate the performance of this? Because some of the queries we use to review access levels are already pretty hefty. But if you do want to do different stuff with different roles, like per project, the roles got to do different things, that makes sense. A member role ID, a member is already a certain person in a certain project. So that makes sense. Why aren't we adding it to the member table, by the way?
I feel like maybe I wish I had my engineer here because I don't know.
Yeah, that's not a fair question for you.
Yeah.
I don't, a member is already, I assume that's a combination between kind of a project and a person. That already seems the place where you should, the reason why we're not adding it there, it's the roles are going to be static. Like every single, if the role has the same names, if someone's in the same role, the name of the role, like they're both, I don't know, reporter, they can do the same things. We're not individualizing it per person, which makes sense.
Right.
Okay. I don't see anything strange with this. Yeah, it would really be nice to already have that download code thing as it something that adds value. But if we're able to ship something even smaller, why not? Like this is complex enough that we can take smaller steps. Yeah, don't have any suggestions. Anybody else?
what I'll toss out there is kind of like, even if we can get past this one, our initial customer value MVC, which is this ability to remove view source code from reporter, my next iteration, I feel like my next iteration is much bigger because it suddenly goes from, okay, let's toggle one little permission off to opening it up and saying you can toggle almost any permission on or off with some exceptions, understanding that it won't make sense for some things to be on when other things are off. But I struggled with this because I kind of think, yeah, just
You're
adding
basic-
one or two more checkboxes at a time, is that valuable? Or is it better to just wait until we can customize most things? You know what I mean? I've struggled with this. I feel like the gap between 2 and 3 is really large.
Yeah, I think what I think I hear you say is say, hey, every row in this table should be a column in this new role table. And that's quite a lot.
Mhm.
So a way to make that smaller before I hand it to Tim might be to group some of these things. Because I think this table is too long anyway. So we should probably start grouping this a little bit more so that it's easier to comprehend. And then whatever grouping you choose to view this table might be a good initial set of columns to give to users. Tim?
I think it's the Symfony PHP framework has solved this in the past, is they give every role a prime number. So every role receives a prime number, and then you can actually store all of those roles in the same column. And then if you can do a database query and say, is this role, so this number is the number that's stored in that role, that database field, divisible by this prime number? And if it is, then that means that role has access. And that can actually be offloaded to the database. You don't have to query that number and then divide it within Ruby. You can actually query that within Postgres, and that would solve the problem. Basically, for every type of thing that we want to turn on and off, you just add you assign it a brand new prime number, and then you add those prime numbers together, and it will never, it will always either be divisible or indivisible.
You mean multiply or add?
Multiply, sorry.
Okay.
Yes, thanks, Dan.
Then we're going to run out of prime numbers, and then we're in the business of finding a really large one.
Exactly. We need to add some quantum accelerator for GitLab.com because the visions get a bit too hard.
I think our prime or our numbers for our database tables are probably going to run out before we run out of prime numbers to find.
That's a technically elegant solution that I don't necessarily recommend to Hannah. But I think I do think it's good to look at how other people solve this. It feels like this can be the first time this got solved. And I think Hannah already looked at that. But is this the view model or something like that?
We had one customer, I don't know if this is what you're referring to, but give us a lot of thoughts on Graph, I believe it was, and how that could be implemented for this. So
I think there's some other people who also did a lot of work. There was a recent Google paper that starts with a Z, which I forgot. But there's a lot of literature. I'd love to see a little bit more of how other great products solve this.
okay.
Well,
Yeah, I think the grouping makes a lot of
sense.
sense.
If I was making this, I'm not giving you homework in the iteration call. That's not what this call is for.
Thanks for the idea about grouping the permissions too. That's a good idea.
Oh, and it's Zanzibar.
Okay.
And this might or might not be a good idea to do. And it's recent for me is 3 years old, which tells you something about my age. But that's Zanzibar inspired a whole bunch of startups who are replicating this way of authenticating because they solved a bunch of the performance problems. So it might be worth a look.
Okay, thanks.